Okay, so just lifting out this rear subframe, which you can see I've tacked on these down tubes, roughly 45 degrees. So this will allow me to probably clamp this here in the vise and go ahead and make these rear welds that will be covered up by these brackets in the end. So a little bit of progress here. All right, I've got this subframe, the rear shock mount, welded, brazed, use your term. Anyway, it's, as we've talked about before, it's silicon bronze TIG welding, which is in effect, you know, sort of recreating the old brazing technique. It creates a bit of, the term you often hear is a softer weld, which means that the metal surrounding the silicon bronze is not as embrittled by the heat. It's something that's done, you know, frequently on motorcycles, and many of the sort of, you'd call it the more expensive production techniques will use the old school brazing, bronze brazing, which is a bit of a dying art. I mean, I'd like to think that I could do it, but probably not. I'm not that good. The TIG allows you a lot of control, and I'm just, since I've got this rear leg up here, this area right here has to fit between the shock mount plates. So I'm just going to take this belt sander and give you a peek at taking off the top of this. In other words, you have to remove some of the weld to fit the plates. This is a very low grit belt on here. You can get the idea that it looks like I'm going to have to use something a little bit more aggressive than this little belt. A little bit down, a little bit down, that little bit down here. So I don't usually smooth welds. I tend to just leave them, warts and all, because they're probably stronger. But again, these plates have to cover this weld, and we don't want to have a huge gap on the plates. Yeah, I'm gonna have to use something a little bit stronger up there. Yeah, much more aggressive. Need to check that. Do the other side. All right, we've got these smoothed and pretty flat, flush here for the shock mount to fit, you know, without sticking out and being wide and making for a wide weld space here, which we don't want. So just kind of leveling that off. So looking good. All right, I've got the sort of rear subframe all welded here, including these tank support mounts, across tube, forward seat plate, mount plate, and it gives you a good way to see right now why we have to kind of go ahead and make this weld first, because this plate, which is the rear shock mount, you know, when it goes into position, it covers up a good half of that weld and would make getting under here and in between the two plates really hard to weld, you know, other than a big gumball mess. So when I guess probably next we'll weld this plate on, and you know, it'll just pick up this halfway point around the tubing and weld and go over this, And again, you can see why I had to use the grinder and the belt sander to flatten this weld so that the plate would go over it without bulging way out at the front and creating a big ugly gap out here on the front side of the plate that we wouldn't want to fill with filler. So anyway, it looks pretty good, I think, you know. So in order to bolt this, to weld this on, I got to reassemble all the frame jigs here and this cross tube here to get everything tight and back in place and repeatable once again. And then ultimately we will make these welds up here to the forward top frame rails. Yet to come. All right, we got everything clamped back into position here. So we can now tack these shock mount plates into position. Since we've fully welded back under them, we can go ahead and tack these in place and then pull the seat fender hoop off again and then fully weld up these plates. But right now on the jig, we'll just tack them up so they stay and hold their position. Got clamps, got both sides ready to go, so we'll do that next. Okay, so we got our shock mount plates brazed in, TIG welded, TIG braze, whatever you want to call it. We got these all in good shape. So we'll put this piece back onto the frame, and that will lead us up to making the attachments here and sort of finalizing all of this. There we go. Back in position roughly. The next thing I want to spend some time on is getting these forward cross pieces done in here. The original wide line and slim line feather beds have just one piece going across here roughly. Since we added our hemispherical joint here to hold this front isolastic, I'm thinking of adding an extra piece here, which I've got just roughed in the vise here. Yeah. And putting it so it ties into the frame right in here. So can't really get in here. It's quick, roughly. Yeah, so roughly in this space. I'll have to make some adjustments here to it, but since we've tied into this down tube here, I want to give it some extra support at this point. Probably add another piece, another cross tube down below here as well. So we're going to end up with an extra piece here that's not on the original, but I think it'll add some strength to the frame, kind of where it's needed with this, you know, application that we have, where we're putting a little bit more stress here on this member. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this piece just a little bit right in here, over here on the vise. It's actually not too bad. Come up a little bit more. Yeah. That puts this cross piece right at this extra bracket location, which will really support that frame leg in terms of how we center this isolastic. So I'm going to trim just a touch more and then call it good. All right, I've got this sort of additional cross tube coped in here. I might push it up just a little higher to tie into this Heim linkage bracket a little better, but this gives you kind of an idea of how this is going to work. Take that just a little bit more up. Yeah. And then got another piece that's going to go down here pretty low. Since we've got this extra one here, I think rather than putting it kind of where it normally is, we'll lower it and gain the benefit of these two together. It'll be an interesting cope kind of on that bend. We'll see. I'll take a first shot at it, show you how it looks, but that's going to go there. So an extra tube over the normal to deal with the added stress of this side-to-side isolastic. Probably a little bit overkill, but you know, we're not racing this bike. You know, a little extra weight for strength hurts nothing. Okay, so just checking back in here. I've got the upper cross tube here that we just put in, and now I've also added one down here lower. So again, just to reiterate, instead of having one right at the engine mount, we've gone with two, again, to support the added stress, I guess, of having the isolastic mount to the frame here. So I'm not going to tack these in yet. I'm going to go ahead and work on another cross tube, just kind of doing these all at once now, that goes right across here, kind of the front forward edge of the gas tank, and then to support the frame neck here. So I'll kind of start to size this one up next. And then once we get these all roughed in, we can take apart whatever we need to go ahead and put in the tacks and get a final position. Continuing on with these cross tubes, you know, the frame tubes that run across. We did the two in the front. Now I'm working on this one in the top. So it's the same process of putting a cope on one end, getting it into position, and then using, even though it's at a slight angle, using a straight edge to come in here and mark where that inner frame touches, and then cut your cope. Now, one thing I've kind of been alluding to is, because of the way that this is going to be a sort of a non-standard featherbed frame, I added an extra down to frame cross tube here to take up some of the stress. And I'm also not liking this open area up here, which is a characteristic of the wide glide frame. The slim glide, which came later, is sort of did away with this tube and came in with something like a 1-inch tube here. Of course, this was much closer together with the slimline. That was kind of the whole point. So what I'm going to do is, of course, leave this in position because it's used to tie the tank strap on. But I'm kind of thinking about adding a 1-inch tube here. So you're going to end up with this tube here, and borrowing from the slimline frame another tube here. And I'm not exactly sure if that's going to hit anything. I don't think it will be a problem as far as an oil tank, or if it's the twin big Norton Commando Atlas style. I don't think it's going to involve that, but it could be in the way of a petcock, or so we're just going to kind of fit this. I'm going to use this forward edge of our removable upper frame tube mount here as a stop So that I'm just going to pull that as far forward as possible on both of these ends. So the next step will be to cope these and get them into position for tacking, and ultimately getting them secure enough that we can remove this whole assembly from our frame jig for final welding, etc. You know, these blades, they get noisier. Teeth break off the more you use them. I've probably made 4 or 5 cuts with, well, more than that with this one, just in this last batch. So they get noisy, you know, but you're gonna tend to kind of clean these up, so it doesn't necessarily matter. This is just a rough starting cut. So, get this piece of crap out of here. It gets all jammed in there. All right, almost done. All right, all good. Let's check the fit. Okay, so checking the fit on this piece we just cut the cope on. You know, it goes in there very nicely. And this is supposed to, I'm hoping you can see this, this piece goes on this upper frame tube just after the turn upwards. There's a subtle, you know, not so subtle when you're looking at it, but when you know what to look for, there's a subtle bend up that goes up to the steering neck here. And this tube goes in just after the turn. So that's kind of what I'm going to use as a guide. I don't know that our frame jig needs something very positive here, because this point in space is going to always kind of be there, that you'll be able to see just that little turn upwards, and that's where this goes, kind of exactly where it is. So that cope turned out well. It seems to fit very snug in terms of the fit and the gaps. So, you know, we want to get it a true, well, it doesn't help if you drop it, but it happens. You know, we'll want to find a way to have this, you know, obviously not be crooked like that, but to have it be truly perpendicular. So I'll have a think on that. But let's move on to this other one and cope it. Okay, so just following along with this same process that we just did on the front, here with the rear, we've coped the far edge. This is a piece of 1 inch round, a little bit thicker than what would have been original, but again, if it's a little heavier but stronger, we're okay with it. So I'll just take this square and make that mark for the inner cope position and move forward. Okay, we've got this cross piece, actually the one we're adding, which is not on an original wide glide, but a similar piece is on a slimline. So we've got that coped, got it butted against these upper frame rail mounts, and then we have the forward one done, just held in with a magnet, and then these two at the front, one of them has decided to fall out. Okay, and here is that upper and lower mounts. So we've got those kind of done. I'm not sure that we need to modify the jig to locate those, beyond what we already have. Definitely will give it some thought. Okay, so, you know, after mulling it, I do have these little, they're designed to mount on round tubes on frames for dirt trackers or whatever. It provides a good locating shape. I welded it onto this support for the upper frame tubes. And by tacking this on here, it provides a very positive stop. And I've got another one on this side. So this is very repeatably located using these steel tube brackets for mounting accessories and things. But put it to a good use, and actually I'll give you a little demonstration. You know, if we knock that back and it's in theory out of position, we can just come in, knock it fully against the round shape that's right in there, and you've got her located. Very positive.